The Man in the Yellow Raincoat. So this is a story that happened to my mom's friend in Korea about 10 years ago. Every time I hear this story, I still get the chills. My mom's friend lived in an apartment complex in Seoul. She was a stay-at-home mother with a young daughter, and her husband worked during the days. One day, she was coming home from running errands with her daughter and got onto the elevator in her building. When she got on, she noticed that there was a man wearing a cap and a yellow raincoat, and he kept his head low so that she really couldn't see his face. She immediately felt really uneasy, and she made her daughter stand by her side, furthest away from the man. What made her feel even more uncomfortable was that when she passed the button for her floor, there was no other lit number, and on top of that, she noticed that he was carrying something wrapped inside newspaper close to his side. Things started to click in my mom's friend's head, and she started to panic and decided to take out her cell phone and pretend she was calling home to her husband, who was obviously really not at home and at work. She started saying things like, "Oh, I'm on the elevator and about to get off. Can you open the door for me?" and making it seem like her husband was waiting at home. When the elevator did reach her floor, I think she lived on the 12th floor or something, she quickly got off and grabbed her daughter and started walking as fast as she could to her apartment. She noticed that the man also got off on her floor and was slowly following her down the hallway. When my mom's friend got to her door, she started to bang on it and shout, "Hey, Yibu, husband/dear, I'm home, please open the door," and kind of pretended like he was coming to answer the door. Upon seeing this, the man in yellow raincoat started to walk away backwards towards the elevator. When he seemed to be far away enough, my friend's mom quickly picked up her daughter and slid open her door's passcode thingy. This is usually how people get into their homes in Korea, and started to frantically punch in her key code. But the problem was that the buttons would make sounds, so the man knew that no one was going to answer the door for her, and he turned around and started running back towards her. My mom's friend, at this point, was practically screaming, and when she finally got her door to open, the first thing she did was throw her daughter in through the door. When she got in herself, she saw that the man was pretty much inches from the door, but she managed to shut it and lock it before he could wedge his hand or weapon into the door. Afterwards, looking through the door's peephole, she saw that the man was walking away back towards the elevator. Several months later, my mom's friend was watching the news, and there was a coverage on the capture of a serial killer named Yoo Young-chul who used to kill a lot of prostitutes. She told my mom that she could never forget the dread she felt when she saw the two familiar raincoat and hat that he was wearing when apprehended. The dog in the road. This particular event happened almost a year ago, sometime in mid-October. A couple friends and I drove to visit an old friend of ours from high school, George, who now lived about an hour out of the city. We spent the whole day with him, and it was really late when we finally decided to start the drive back home. My friend Lisa was passed out in the passenger seat. She had had a few drinks and decided to spend the ride home asleep. My other friend Sam was sitting in the back seat behind Lisa and was playing a game on her smartphone. I, of course, was driving. I was following the GPS's instructions back to the freeway. At that moment, we were driving down a dark street with thick trees bordering both sides. Everything was pretty peaceful, with the only sounds I could hear being that of the car moving along the road and the radio on low volume. Suddenly, my car let out a loud jolt, and it felt as if I had hit something. Sam let out a shocked scream while Lisa remained dead asleep. I slammed on the brakes and the car came to a halt. I was breathing heavily when I asked what the hell had just happened. Sam peered through the back window and gasped. She turned to me with an angry look on her face and shouted that I had just hit a dog. I looked through the back window and, sure enough, A dog was lying in the road a few yards behind the car. Sam is a pretty big animal lover, so I wasn't surprised to see her get pissed at me. She was about to open her door and rush to the animal's aid when I stopped her. Once I had gotten over the shock of running over a dog, I got a feeling in my gut that told me that something was off. I'm not a braggart, but I consider myself to be a very attentive and safe driver. My eyes were on the road at all times, and I distinctly remember not seeing any dog in the road prior to the car jolting. Yes, it was dark, but I was sure that I would have at least seen the dog in the headlights before hitting it. I looked through the back window and took a closer look at the dog, or at least as much as I could make out in the reddish light coming from my taillights. It was a fairly big dog, at least a golden retriever or something like that. One particular detail caught my attention. I could see the dog's tail wagging. Now, I'm no expert on the mannerisms of an animal, but I was sure the last thing a dog would be doing after being hit by a car would be to wag its tail. After a moment of thought, I pressed my foot down on the accelerator and sped off. Sam snapped at me and ordered me to go back, but I told her that something was wrong with the whole situation. She continued to argue, but she fell silent as she turned back towards the back window. She asked, "What the heck?" in a shaken voice. I looked in the rearview mirror. Though it was dark, I was able to make out the silhouettes of 3 large figures emerging from the trees on the side of the road. The dog was now up on its feet and jumping around joyfully. The 3 figures looked in our direction as I pressed my foot down on the gas harder and sped off. Sam and I remained silent for the rest of the ride home. It wasn't until a few days later we told Lisa about it. We've been back to visit George a few times since, but we always make sure to leave before sunset. Still, I dread to think about what would have happened if we had gotten out of the car. Night vision. It was the summer before my senior year in college. My little brother, always interested in military stuff, had gotten a pair of night vision goggles for his birthday, and he'd left them at my apartment. One night I was bored and decided to go try out the goggles at a wooded hiking/nature preserve nearby. In retrospect, this seems like a really stupid idea since I was all by myself, and female. But I was young and stupid, and I got myself all excited at the possibility of seeing deer and other woodland creatures in their natural nighttime habitat. I was familiar with these woods. My best friend and I had hiked there at night before, and we'd never run into anyone else. Our area is mostly rural and pretty safe, so I didn't anticipate any trouble. I parked in the little sparsely lit parking area, ignored the sign "Parking closes at 10" and entered the woods, night vision goggles in hand. It was a half moon that night, and that was the only light that filtered through the canopy of trees. It was pretty dark, and I didn't want to put on the goggles until I found a place to sit down, so I lit my way with a mini mag light on my keychain. A couple of times I thought I heard a little rustling in the woods a fair distance away, but it was nothing out of the ordinary, and I put it down to animal activity. Hopefully the deer I'd come hoping to see. After I had hiked in a fair distance, I found a fallen log to sit on and put on the goggles. I don't know if you've ever used night vision goggles before, but the effect is impressive. They can turn near pitch darkness into bright as day. Everything appears in shades of green, but quite bright and clear. For a while, I had a blast looking around from my fallen log vantage point. Some chipmunks played around in the leaves nearby, and a big owl blinked its lamp-like eyes at me from a tree branch. No deer, though, and I started to think that maybe they wouldn't be likely to come anywhere near me. Darkness or no, if I sat right out in the open on a log, so I decided to find a place where I could be a little more hidden. I made my way a little deeper into the woods and finally found a huge tree, perfect for climbing. I've always loved climbing trees, so it was nothing for me to hoist myself up a few branches and settle in to wait for my deer. I didn't get to see any. What I did see, lit up in bright night vision green after about 10 minutes of waiting. Was this a man, dressed head to toe in dark-colored clothing, making his way stealthily through the woods? He was coming from the same direction I'd come and was clearly trying to stay hidden, moving from tree to tree and glancing around carefully before moving on again. It looked very much like he was looking for someone. It took me a few moments to notice that he was carrying something, and when I saw what it was, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. He had a knife, a big one, and he was gripping it as if he expected to use it in the very near future. Wasn't deer hunting season, and this was a nature preserve where hunting of any kind is prohibited. And at any rate, the guy was alone and not dressed like a hunter. There were no deer in sight, and very few hunters kill their prey with knives. I was suddenly horribly aware of my situation. A young woman alone, weaponless, in the middle of the woods at night. This was the 90s, so no cell phones, and even if I had one, I wouldn't have felt safe using it lest I draw his attention. I didn't know how he was able to see so well in the dark. I guess his eyes had just adjusted, and I was terrified he would look up and see me. I sat there, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, and watched him as he continued his methodical and stealthy process of scanning the forest for who, or whatever the hell he was stalking. I scanned around but couldn't see anyone else, even from my high vantage point, and the sickening thought struck me that he might be looking for me. I remembered the rustling noises I heard in the woods when I first arrived, and then I thought back further and remembered something else. A white car that had followed too close behind me for most of my drive to the nature preserve. I had been annoyed and a little freaked out at the time, but when I turned into the nature preserve parking area, the white car had passed me and driven on its way, and I hadn't thought anything more of it. Now I wondered, horrified, if this was the driver of that car, if he'd circled back and seen my parked car, alone in the lot, if he'd come in after me. I sat, paralyzed with fear, and watched the man for what felt like forever but was probably another half hour or so. There was a heart-stopping moment when he paused right underneath my tree and I was sure he was going to look up and find me. But he didn't. After a while he seemed to give up on whatever plan he had in mind. I heard him say, "Fuck it," and he started heading back in the direction he'd come, the direction of the parking area. I stayed in the tree, wet with sweat and crying, until the sun came up a few hours later. Then I climbed down and, still terrified, gripping the little can of pepper spray on my keychain, I made my way as fast as I could to the parking lot. The man had been there. My windshield had been smashed with a rock, and someone had scraped all down the sides of the car with something sharp, presumably a giant knife that I'm lucky it didn't end up in my chest. Thank God for the night vision goggles that let me see him before he could see me. And thank God for big trees with steady branches. Creepy forest rapists, let's never meet again. Violin Hill. Around 2 years ago, I finally moved into a brand new house in a brand new building estate in Australia. I was one of the first to have a finished building in the area and was elated to finally gain independence. The first few weeks went by as normal, and during that time, I'd often take walks alone with the dog in the afternoons and roam the surrounding estate area. All the roads around us had been partially completed and all the other properties were marked out, but no other houses were built excluding one that was directly opposite of mine. The house looked finished, but there was no driveway laid yet, and from what I could gather, no one lived there. To the left of my house, roughly a few hundred meters away, was a field with a huge hill in it. I later found out that the whole area was council property. Not only was no one allowed to build up there, but the whole hill was basically a no-go zone. For whatever reason, The council just didn't want people on it, so the whole area was surrounded by a huge chain link fence. The only other noticeable feature in the area was a small abandoned farmhouse with a shed a few kilometers down the road. I knew nothing about it and often went walking there with the dog, as it gave me something mild to explore amongst the vast nothingness I was living around. The entire place was dilapidated and completely inhabitable. A month or two after moving in, I awoke one morning to the sound of a violin. It sounded extremely distant and quite haunting. I actually enjoyed it and assumed that the neighbors opposite of me has finally moved in. Excited that I finally had some people to talk to, I peeked out of the curtain and saw the house opposite mine was still as vacant as it ever was. I got dressed, but by the time I managed to look outside, the violin has stopped. This happened roughly every second day for the next week. The violin would wake me up and then disappear after about 45 seconds. I'd ignore it to the point where curiosity simply got the better of me, and the next morning when I heard the violin playing again, I immediately jumped out of bed, threw on my dressing gown, and shot out of the front door. I scoured the early morning surrounding, and there, up on the hill, was a figure playing a violin. It was barely light, but the person looked very tall from the distance I was at, and as they were playing, was doing what could only be described as a waltz-type walk, spinning slowly around in a circle as they played. I took my eyes off the person and walked over to pick up the morning paper, and in the 10 seconds that took me, I heard the violin stop. When I looked up, I noticed the figure was no longer playing or dancing, but was now standing still and most likely looking in my direction. It was so dark that I couldn't make out and more, and we both just stood there for half a minute, not moving before the creeps got the better of me and I went back inside. After that morning, things started happening. On my walks, I began to notice footprints on the surrounding properties that weren't made by me that I'd never seen before, which I just assumed were from people walking up from the other housing areas down the road. I never awoke to the violin, but I swear I could hear someone walking on the street next to my bedroom window in the early mornings. However, I never saw anything. Other really general things as well, like random tools such as spades and rakes laying around the area, which I guessed were left there by construction crews, none of which I ever saw. I had started getting calls at work that would immediately hang up on me, and I never stopped waking up to the abandoned farmhouse, as the experience with the violin player had me a little shaken. One night as I was heading to bed, I turned off the television in the living room and, again, could hear the faint sound of a violin playing. However, it sounded more muffled and rehearsed. I froze and a cold chill flowed through me instantaneously. Considering that it was about midnight and not the usual time I'd hear it playing, I went to the front window and peeked out to see there was a light in the house opposite mine. It was clearly a candle, as I could see the dim light flicker in the empty window, and the music sounded like it was coming from an old record player. But in the 10 minutes I watched, I never saw any movement inside the house. I moved away from the window, sufficiently freaked out, and after another 5 minutes, I heard the music abruptly stop. I peeked out again to notice the light was now out. I never saw anyone. I began to become unsettled in the house and would often invite friends over to hang out until late. But of course nothing would ever happen when someone else was with me. I never bothered to tell any of my friends, as without evidence, I figured they'd just give me shit about it and I'd just become more agitated. But nothing compared to what happened next. In my living area, the desk sits right next to a small window which looks out to the fence surrounding my property. The steel fence is literally an arm's length from the house and about 6 feet tall, so I always figured that, unlike most of the other windows, I'd never need to cover this one with a sheet or blanket because no one could ever see in. I usually had headphones on when I played, and I always had the lights off, for no other reason than I preferred to play games in the dark. One night when I was gaming, I got up and walked into the dark kitchen and got a beer out of the fridge. It was dead silent, excluding the faint sound coming out of my headphones. As I closed the fridge and turned around to face the desk, I saw directly out the window two very, very faint lights. I didn't even catch on and immediately started walking back to the desk, fixated on the small glowing balls, and it wasn't until I had my nose almost pressed against the glass that I realized two lights weren't lights at all. They were eyes. A set of eyes, sitting just above the fence line, staring wide open at me. They didn't blink. They didn't move. My entire body locked up. All I could do was simply stare back, as my brain was still comprehending that there was an actual person looking at me in the scariest way I could possibly ever imagine. I don't know what happened. Either my head kicked into gear or my muscles loosened, but my body automatically collapsed and I fell to the floor, scurrying to hide against the wall away from the window. I could hear my heart beating through the carpet like a drum as I tried to lay as flat as possible, and as my mind was still processing the sheer severity of the situation, a violin started playing. The fucking violin and the haunting tune it always emitted started up, except this time it was directly outside my window and much louder than I'd ever heard it before. The lights were still off and I wanted to get up to turn off the PC screen so I couldn't be seen. But my whole body just wasn't ready to cooperate. Not only was the sound of the instrument extraordinarily loud, but it sounded like it was being played with frustration, notes been missed frequently and the strings screeching. The pace of it was getting faster and faster, and by this time, my dog Jeb out in the backyard had picked up on the situation and, registering an unfamiliar sound, gave one solitary, deep bark. The violin instantly stopped and the house was finally dead silent, excluding my headphones, which I could hear quietly working away. I was still frozen to the carpet, and it wasn't until Jeb gave a second menacing bark that I heard the figure outside the window start to walk away in the direction of my yard. Once the first footstep hit the ground, I instantly thought of the welfare of my best mate, and finally, my head connected with my extremities and my entire body kicked into overdrive. I leapt from the ground and slid across the laminated floor to the back door where Jeb was standing, staring into the backyard. I ducked to keep low and quietly unlocked and slid open the door. Usually doing so would notify Jeb that he was allowed inside, but when the door opened up, he didn't move an inch and was completely fixated on the pitch-black backyard. Everything told me not to go outside, but there was no chance I was letting anything happen to my dog, and I moved on to the alfresco, moved behind Jeb, put my hand under his collar and attempted to back him towards the house. Jeb is a pure Labrador and weighs like a sack of sand, so when he doesn't want to move, it'll take a sheer force to pull him in the direction you want him to go, and right now, Jeb wasn't going anywhere. I yanked at his scruff, and as I did, he emitted a bark like I've never heard before. A deep, bellowing, fuck you right off sound that elevated my nerves to an all-time high. We both just stood there, waiting for some form of reply, and I couldn't remember how long we both just froze there. But eventually, I heard footsteps from around the side of the house begin to walk away, but not a simple walk. Almost like whoever was doing it was slowly dancing in a circle, the footsteps keeping to a beat as they drifted away from the house into the distance. Once I couldn't hear anything, Jeb licked his lips, gave me a look and wandered back inside. I followed, locked the door behind me and spent the night reverting back to my childlike self, hiding under my bed covers with my dog. I didn't sleep a wink. That was the last time I ever saw or heard the violin player. The following morning, when the sun finally came up, I called into work sick and called the police. They scoured the lot next to mine and found footprints in the dirt. However, there were so many there that it was impossible to tell whose were whose. The only description I could give to the officer was his height. He would have had to be over 6 feet to stare over that fence at me, but they explained that he could have been standing on something, or on his toes. They also told me that they've never received a report of anyone playing a violin in the area or anyone been in the fenced-off hill either. I essentially looked like an insane person, but the officers were very nice about the whole thing and offered to patrol the area for the next few nights, which helped put my mind at ease. Nothing else has happened since then. Over the next year or two, people finally started moving in, and I tell them all the story about the figure I saw, some of which still used to keep their children in line, which I found funny. One guy nicknamed the council lot Violin Hill, and the name has stuck around our street since then. I even spent a period of time scouring the depths of the internet for that violin tune I kept hearing, but could never find it. There were a few classical pieces that seemed reminiscent, but I've since thought that whatever tune was played must have been self-composed, which creeps me out even more. I'm still in the house. I still tell people the story, and I haven't changed my routine one bit, which has really helped me block out the fear of the experience. I game with the blinds closed now. Out of gas. I grew up in an extremely rural Midwestern state. My family lived in the country between two small towns. I had attended school in both towns and knew most of the families in the area either by face or last name. One night, it was about 10 or 11, and I was leaving a high school basketball game in Town A. I was around 15 and driving on my school permit past curfew. I had borrowed my uncle's car, an early 90s Toyota with a leak in the gas tank that caused me to run out of gas before I made it more than 5 or 6 miles out of town, and I had about 7 left to go. I was on a long stretch of road that served as a shortcut between two main highways in the aforementioned town and wasn't heavily traveled. There were a few houses, but they were stretched far apart, and at the time, as well as to this day, cell phone reception was very spotty. I waited a while, and finally a nice, newer red truck with an extended cab, a toolbox in the back, and a construction company logo on the side pulled up. It was a Friday or Saturday night, and there was a man inside with a woman and 2 girls. He offered me his phone. I remember noticing it was a track phone, which my friends and I at the time referred to as crack phones because you can't trace the owners and they are frequently used by drug addicts. They're also used by a lot of people who can't afford a standard phone plan. But the family was driving a really nice car and they seemed super clean cut, so it struck me as odd. The phone got no reception. I tried calling my parents a few times and finally gave up. The truck had been headed away from Town B towards Town A, where I had just come from. So when they offered me a ride, I thought nothing of it. I had a gas can in the trunk and all my friends lived in Town A. So I figured they could drop me off at the gas station on the way to their destination and I could find a ride back with somebody I knew. When I got in the car, I was caught off guard by the way the woman, who I assumed was his wife, and the 2 girls, who I assume were their children, were dressed. Conservative families, even Amish and Mennonites aren't common where I'm from, but for the man being otherwise modern, wearing jeans, driving a sort of flashy truck, and owning a cell phone. The female's clothing surprised me. They all wore long, heavy skirts with button-up blouses and thin bonnets on their heads. One of the girls seemed to have a disability and made grunting noises every so often. Other than her noises, the women were completely silent. Everything seemed fine to me until the man driving turned around and started driving the opposite way of the direction he'd been driving. The closest town the other way was still 15 or so miles, and it seemed out of his way. Out of politeness, I reminded him that I had come from Town A, knew everyone there, and could find a ride home. It was late and I figured he needed to get his family where they were going. That's when he told me that he was from Town B and that he had a full gas can waiting at his house, and that he would take me there and bring me back to my car to fill it up. Still trying to be polite, I told him it was unnecessary, and my house was on the way to Town B, just a few miles away, and he could drop me off there. He didn't reply. I started to feel like something was off. I'm from an area where people go out of their way to help others, but it seemed like too much. I had insisted numerous times that he didn't have to drive nearly 30 miles out of his way to get me gas. He could simply drop me off on his way to his destination, or if he wanted to make sure I made it home fine, he could drop me off at home. In my uneasiness, I started making small talk. I asked him his name, and his last name was unfamiliar to me, which was surprising, but not totally unbelievable, coming from a town of around 3,000 people where I had spent the first decade of my life, and where both of my parents still worked. I remember wishing that I had paid attention to the construction company name on the side of the truck, since most companies in my area were named after a family. As we got closer to the turnoff to my house, I started to get more frantic. I realized that these people, who didn't even seem overly friendly, were insisting that we drive completely out of the way, late at night, in a rural community, to fix a fairly commonplace mishap. I had no idea who they were. I had never seen them before, and I had no cell phone reception, and their cell phone was undetectable. Even if it wasn't what they were trying to do, making me disappear would be a pretty easy task. I started kind of shrieking that they just dropped me off at my house, but nobody in the car seemed like they heard me. Finally, in a fit of panic, I screamed at the top of my voice, "This is my town. Take me home. Please take me home right now." Finally, for the first time, the wife spoke up, yelling at the man angrily and somewhat annoyed. Just fucking take her home. Outside of the girl's grunting, the car fell silent. He swerved angrily onto my road, pulled into my driveway, let me out, and then reversed out of the driveway so fast the tires spit gravel and I couldn't even see the license plate or the name of the company through the dust. I ran inside and woke up my parents to tell them what happened. They just yelled at me because I was driving past curfew. I don't know for sure what the intentions were, and maybe they just wanted to help, but I felt really uneasy the whole time. Not as scary as some stuff on here, but that's my experience. Terrorized for 2 hours. This happened when I was in college. I lived in Isla Vista, the student community at UCSB, notorious for being a party school. It fully lived up to its reputation. I liked to party, but holy shit, these people were off the wall. As such, there were a lot of people who put themselves in dangerous situations, drinking to excess, not being careful, not locking doors, etc. It had a very isolated and insular vibe, and anyone who was hanging around who wasn't college age immediately looked out of place and strange. One night after having a few drinks, I came home to my small house where I lived with 2 other girls, probably around 2:30 a.m. We were all serious students. I was probably the least serious, actually. And when we partied, it was not your typical UCSB mega rager, more like a small get-together with friends. We would often have a few people spend the night, sleep on our furniture, in our beds, as the case may be. That night, my roommates had had a few people over who I didn't know, and I saw when I returned home that one of them opted to sleep on the couch from the shadow that I saw there. I didn't turn on the light so I wouldn't wake anyone up, but I was passing the couch to enter my bedroom. I noticed that the figure was lying very stiff. He just had this weird energy to him. He was lying down, but it was like he was putting all of his energy into lying as still and rigid as possible. I paused, and the guy quickly jerked his head to face me, without moving his limbs. so quickly that it startled me. I could see his wide open eyes glinting in the dark. Figuring that I'd startled him, or that he was drunk, or maybe some kind of stimulant and unable to sleep, I just hurried past into my bedroom and locked the door. The dude made me nervous, and I wasn't taking any chances. I fell asleep. At 4:30 a.m., I woke up. There was a strange sound at the door, almost like somebody was drumming their fingers against the wood very quietly. I lay still and listened. There were more quiet sounds, like someone scratching the door with their fingers, which got louder and louder until it was clear that he was using both hands and scratching as fast and as hard as possible. It created an extremely loud and intimidating sound that filled me with fear. I got my cell phone and texted my roommate because I was afraid to make a sound. "Your friend is freaking me out. Is he coked out? Can you talk to him? He's banging and scratching on my door." She didn't text me back, probably because she was asleep. I texted my other roommate to the same effect, covering all my bases. Keep in mind that the scratching had been going on at this point for a couple minutes. I have no idea how he could have sustained it. Scratching a wooden door with your fingernails can't feel good. He also grabbed at the knob and jiggled it super forcefully. Because neither of them answered, I decided to call and really wake them up, though I was scared to make a sound. I knew it sounds stupid, but there was something seriously horrifying about being teased like this through the door. I knew that he was trying to terrify me. I felt like a little kid, but I could tell this guy was fucked up or something, and maybe the police needed to be called. And I wanted to loop my roommates in since it was one of their friends. The scratching stopped abruptly, and I called my roommate, who answered sleepily. "Yo, your friend is messed up. Can you please deal with it? Do we need to call the cops? He's seriously scaring me, and he was scratching at my bedroom door. Really fucking weird." She didn't say anything for several seconds, and when she did speak, her voice had no sleepiness in it at all. "What friend?" she said. "That fucking guy that was sleeping on a couch?" I said. She was quiet again. "We didn't have any guys over," she said. "Call the police." My adrenaline surged, and I told her to please lock the bedroom door as quickly as possible. I realized that I hadn't heard scratching in a while and had no clue where the dude had gone. Suddenly, I heard a loud banging on the other side of the house, where my roommates, Lauren and Monica, shared a bedroom. The bangs were followed by the sounds of them screaming in fear. I quickly dialed the police as this maniac proceeded to bang against the, luckily, locked bedroom door of my two roommates as they screamed. The heaviness of the blows left no doubt that he was trying to break the door down. I told the 911 operator the situation, and she dispatched 2 squad cars. The police in Isla Vista are generally used to peeling drunks off the sidewalks and breaking up brawling frat bros. This was really serious and strange, and I think the dispatcher got the sense from my tone how terrified I was, and she stayed on the phone with me. At one point, the banging stopped and everything was quiet for a while. I talked with the dispatcher and suddenly looked down to see that this guy had slipped his fingers through the 1-inch gap between my door and the floor and was just kind of wiggling them around, making this weird growling sound. I screamed and backed away, which is my biggest regret about this situation, since when I look back it would have been so awesome to just stomp the shit out of those fingers and hear the guy howl in pain. When the cops rolled up, I heard running and the sound of our sliding glass door opening and closing. Then he was gone. The cops never caught him. He had broken in through our side door by jimmying the lock somehow. My door was covered in what turned out to be huge gouges he had made using a pair of scissors, which he discarded on the ground before he left. What terrifies me the most about this was that I walked right past him. I looked him right in the face. I realized now that he was not trying to sleep or on drugs, but was lying so stiff like that because he was hiding. He probably heard me open the door, and freaked out because he hadn't realized there was another girl living there, and tried to blend into the couch in the darkness. Stalkers in the Canyon. About 4 years ago, I was a junior at a small college in LA County. Bordering my town was a large cavernous region known as Turnbull Canyon. It's the kind of place that has a healthy amount of creepy folklore surrounding it, with an area emphatically known as Hell's Gate. Stories of cultic activity, gang killings, abandoned mental health institutions, and the like. The kind of shit you hear about any place old enough to have a reputation. In reality, most of the stories were spurned from a tragedy that occurred years prior. A woman's body was found at the base of the canyon, and from then on the rest is history. Nevertheless, when a photographer friend asked me and another buddy to go out to the canyon in order to take some photos of the LA skyline, I had to oblige. The canyon was about a 30-minute drive from our campus, and we had been listening to the King of Limbs the entire drive, which proved to be the perfect ambience to get me feeling pretty anxious about our little excursion. I should also note that I'm a pretty anxious guy in general, so traveling out to a remote area preceded by its reputation for scary occurrences admittedly had me thinking twice about the decision. At the top of the canyon, there's a small residential area and a few ritzy houses, surrounded by trees and woods. In order to venture into the canyon itself, you have to follow a main trail with several smaller arteries that split off in other directions, but ultimately culminate, after a couple miles or so, at the base of a steep hill adorned with a small water tower overlooking the city. Anyhow, we parked our car at the top of the canyon road, divided up the camera gear, and made our way out to the trail ahead. Around 1 a.m. at this point, after walking the trail for about 5 minutes, Dave, the photographer, decided it was time to set up his first shot while Jeff, our other friend, and I kept watch. Eventually, he got the shot he needed, and we continued walking for another 5 or so minutes before Dave decided to set up his next shot. At this point, the trailhead had disappeared behind us completely, and we were a little less than a quarter of the way to the water tower. While setting up the tripod, we noticed the faint glow of headlights off in the distance, which was strange because the trail isn't meant for cars, nor is it big enough for them to pass through. If I recall, it's only about 5 feet wide, with shrubbery on both sides. This was clearly a bit of a red flag for us, as we were the only people out there, so we immediately packed up our things and ducked off into the brush, waiting for the car to pass on. Eventually, an old pickup truck idled to a stop about 50 yards from where we were hiding. The truck itself was old and rickety, sitting on a lifted chassis, the bed of which was missing entirely. Growing up in the country, I knew it was the type of truck typically owned by backwoods folk who lived in the boonies and preferred to be left to their own devices. We watched in agonizing anticipation as the truck just idled in place for several minutes before flooring it down one of the other trails, the roar of the engine echoing throughout the canyon. Clearly, we were spooked at this point, the three of us speculating as to our next step. Jeff and I were reluctant to continue, while Dave assured us that it was probably nothing, perhaps just a guy off-roading, as he put it. So, with great reluctance, Jeff and I trudged on behind Dave towards the water tower to get his final shot. Nevertheless, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the truck. I mean, I knew plenty of people in high school who would go off-roading for fun in the woods, but never on finicky canyon trails barely wide enough to hike on, let alone drive. It just didn't sit right with me. After walking without interference for about an hour, we finally made it out to the water tower, climbed the hill to the top, and took the view of the city. Dave, once again, started setting up his equipment while Jeff and I stood on both sides of the water tower. keeping watch just in case the truck came back. Nothing. At this point, it's around 3 a.m. Dave decided that he'd got all the shots he needs, so we pack up our equipment and commit to heading back before it gets too late, seeing as how all of us have classes in just a few hours. Just as we were preparing to descend the hill, the truck comes roaring out of the canyon below us, back onto the trail, at which point the driver attempts to climb the hill, revving the engine loudly. Scared shitless, the three of us slid off the side of the hill into the brush, clinging to plates and rocks. As the truck finally made it to the top of the hill, slowly driving around the tower, we could see the glow of the headlights each time it circled above us. After waiting for nearly 10 minutes, while also trying not to make any noise, the truck eventually descended the hill, stopping in the middle of the trail no more than 100 yards away. We watched as a scruffy man, mid-50s, stepped out of the idling truck and into the glow of its headlights, moseying around while looking at the ground. He then knelt down, looking at something in the dirt, surveying the area intently. As he did so, it became increasingly apparent that he was tracking something. Our footprints. This next part still chills me to the bone, as my friends and I huddled together watching in complete terror. Another man wearing a long, dark polka emerged from the brush, right where we have been hiking, joining the other man at his side. Apparently, he had been out there the entire time we were walking the trail, just watching us, following behind at a safe distance. The two of them talked for a long while, but we couldn't hear a word. They continued scanning the area, looking at our footprints, but eventually got in the truck and drove down one of the forks in the trail. We sat in silence for a long time and waiting nearly 2 hours just to ensure the coast was clear, at which point we made like hell back to the car, down the hill, and back to our campus, just in time for class.